For a start, Lincoln was decidedly against slavery, and I think it's a myth that he was a racist. Okay, that's a myth. That's a myth that people on the left have allowed themselves also to buy into. Okay, but at the same time, while Lincoln was portrayed by generations as the great emancipator for signing the Emancipation Proclamation and for pursuing the end of slavery, we shouldn't forget that the way in which he was able to do that was, first of all, that the southern states, the white supremacists in the South, split from the Union, because as much as Lincoln wanted to end slavery, as much as he wanted to do it, he couldn't do it until he had the, if you like, the power and authority to do it. And even then, when they split, the authority that he used to sign the Emancipation Proclamation was the authority afforded as commander-in-chief during the war. Okay, and because in fact he only in essence signed the Emancipation Proclamation liberating the slaves in the states that had seceded, not the border states not the border states. But the other thing, and this is really important, is what empowered him to do it wasn't simply that the Confederacy seceded. It was also the fact that African American slaves, in their hundreds and thousands and even tens of thousands, left their plantations during the course of the war to make their way as quickly as they could to the Union lines. And especially in the case of the men, but the women too, presumably, were asking to be in some ways enlisted into the war effort against the white slaveholders in the South. And by the way, that they already had enlisted African American troops in the North in the effort. And basically, by the end of the war, I believe 250,000 men in the Union Army were themselves men of color. So it isn't just that slaves emancipated themselves. It did require, I mean, Lincoln, it's a kind of dialectic, you might say, Lincoln and the slaves. So okay. And then of course the radical Republicans, who are significant, especially because they would have liked to have really dispossessed the slaveholders in the South, just literally carried out land reform in the South. And Reconstruction was an important part of that. They never really did get to carry out the kinds of radical changes that they envisioned. But those who, in the late 20th century into the 21st century, who say, how can Republicans be racist? It's a Republican Party initiative that, emancipated the slaves. Well, it's interesting, if you look over the many years, the Republican Party has literally turned its back on the Lincoln tradition for generations. So much so, by the way, and this can segue us a bit into the Roosevelt years, is that in 1930 or 31, I guess it was, Roosevelt said to a major historian who had written quite a bit on Jefferson and Hamilton and all of that. It was considered one of the sort of Democratic Party intellectuals of around the early 1930s. And Roosevelt wrote to him and said, basically, the Democratic Party can lay claim to Jefferson, but we ought to really lay claim to Lincoln too, since the Republicans have abandoned him. Now, it's important to realize that the Southern states were, during the 20th century, well, ever since the mid-19th, were states dominated by Democratic Party regimes, white supremacist Democratic Party regimes. But it is also the case that Roosevelt was eager to lay claim to Lincoln in part because of the fact that, in his own way, he did want to sort of nudge the Democratic Party away from that kind of segregationist tradition. It was very hard to do that, however, because of the fact that he really did need the Southern votes in Congress, because we shouldn't forget, committees in Congress are organized by seniority. So the House members and Senate members who are there the longest are the ones who get to chair the committees. And in the South, the Democratic Party was so strong, they really ran one-party governments in the South. And in that sense, if you were elected to the Senate, you could spend the rest of your life in the Senate without any real challenge. So as a consequence, Southern senators chaired the committees that FDR needed approval from to pass so much of the New Deal legislation. And the New Deal legislation did not did not contain racism in the sense that there in the under the 14th Amendment, you couldn't legislate racially.
Right.
So what Southern senators did is they legislated occupationally.
Mm,
So they excluded agricultural workers from
yeah.
both Social Security and the rights of labor to organize and bargain collectively. I mean, it was the case that it it didn't exclude by race, it excluded by occupations. Similarly, household workers were left out of Social Security,
Right.
which, by the way, also affected in parts of the country Irish Americans who themselves had been for many years household workers in the North, in New England states. And similarly, excluding agricultural workers not only excluded Blacks in the South, it also excluded Mexican American agricultural workers in the
Yeah.
Southwest. So anyhow, that's just as a point to all of this. So your friends who tell you, well, how could Republicans be considered racist? Well, let's put it this way: there are plenty of racists to go around, both on the in the Democratic Party and the
Yeah.
Republican Party. But the Republican Party, for some time now, has really had a monopoly over questions of race and racism, which is really tragic to say, but that is the case. And if Lincoln were alive today, I have little hesitation in saying he might well be a Democrat. He decidedly would not be a Republican.
Right.
And in fact, he would likely find the Democratic Party much too moderate, much too
Yeah.
centrist, because Abraham Lincoln, I haven't written a book on Lincoln myself yet, though I've often thought I've written little pieces, but Lincoln was really what you would call a proto-social democrat, meaning he's kind of like one of the earliest of social democratic political figures in American history. If you like, I can explain what that means for anyone listening. It's
Yeah.
the
Sure. Go
fact
ahead.
he signed into law. Let's start with the fact that Bernie Sanders called for free public higher education,
Yeah.
which was not all that radical an idea, since state universities had historically had very low tuition. In some states, free tuition at public universities. All you had to do was pay student fees. Okay,
Yeah.
so where does that come from? Well, back in 1862, Lincoln signed into law the Morrill Act, which is called the Land Grant Act, which gave each of the states a certain amount of land, which they could then turn into resources to create, which they were intended to create public, that is, state universities. So in every state, there are now land grant universities. In Wisconsin, it's the University of Wisconsin. In Minnesota, it's probably the Minnesota State University System or the University of Minnesota. I'm not quite sure which that would be, but it's probably University of Minnesota, but I
Yeah.
really don't know for a fact. And I'm saying that because you're in Minnesota.
Right.
So
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
thing is, for a start, he actually envisioned essentially very low cost state or public higher education. This is Lincoln, the sort of like the advanced guard of 20th century FDR social democracy. Similarly, the Homestead Act, and there are any number of things that Lincoln signed into law because he believed that government we create government to do for ourselves what we cannot do on our own. And
Mm,
that's a very social democratic ideal of how to improve the public good, how
yeah.
to enhance democracy. So there you go.